Hello, everyone. If I could have your attention. Hi, my name is Courtland Bobchinski, and it is my joy and honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Mr. Benjamin Nolot. I first met Mr. Nolot a few summers ago when I interviewed him for an article on his documentary Nefarious. Talking to him inspired me to learn more about the sex trafficking industry along with the sexualization of culture. His passion for these issues is contagious. I remember asking him how he maintained a positive outlook on humanity when he has traveled around the world and seen humans at their worst and most deprived state. I clearly remember him answering with one word: Jesus. Mr. Nolot truly reflects the heart of Jesus as he works to free the oppressed. He has spent years building awareness of the cruelty and the oppression of the commercial sex industry. He is the founder and president of Exodus Cry, which is an organization that works to restore and rehabilitate victims of human trafficking. He is also the producer, director, and writer of Nefarious, which is a documentary that works to expose the injustice of the global sex trade. So without further ado, I'd ask you to welcome Mr. Benjamin Nolot to speak.
Good. Thank you all so much. It's such an honor to share this time with you guys, to be invited to speak here, and thank you so much, Courtland, for helping to organize this. I'm just so passionate about seeing the next generation mobilized into action to confront the social injustices of our time. And so just grateful to participate in an event that is taking ownership of that mandate and wanting to see that happen. I've had a chance to meet a few of the law students, and it's just, there's such amazing things happening here on this campus right now. I'm deeply encouraged by that. I'll share just for a few minutes tonight, start off with a little bit of my own personal story. I grew up in Southern California, and so behind my house were like these endless fields, miles and miles extended endlessly up into the hills. And I had kind of this idyllic childhood. It was very sheltered. I was the youngest of 4 kids, and my friends and I would go back and ride motorcycles and build forts and hunt snakes and basically do all the things that, little boys love to do. Spent my childhood exploring the outdoors, and it was amazing. But when I turned 11 years old, I was awakened to the presence of evil in our world in a way that I had never considered or conceived of before in my life in that time at that young age. And basically what happened is I was exposed to a movie called The Accused, which is this true story of a lady named Cheryl Arroyo, sorry. And this lady was brutally gang raped in a public setting in a bar, and the movie is about that particular incident and her ensuing fight for justice. Now, I don't know how I saw that movie at 11 years old. If my parents just rented the wrong movie or what happened. But here I am, 11-year-old child, living this idyllic childhood, very sheltered. And I see this rape scene, and I had no idea, how to even process that as a young child. But I do remember vividly being marked in a deep, life-changing way. And I grew up from that moment with this haunting feeling in the back of my mind and deep within my spirit that rape has to be the worst thing that could ever happen to a person. I remember just trying to wrap my mind around it, the humanity that is robbed from a person in a violent act of perpetration like that. And I wrestled with that all growing up, but I had no idea the scope or, the statistics or anything like that concerning rape in our world today. And I assumed that these were one-off incidences that happened here or there, and how horrific that must be. And so that injustice, I think, pierced me at a young age. It broke my heart, and And in a sense, I was raised by my mom and my two sisters and my grandma, and so I've always kind of gravitated towards women's issues. And but this issue of rape was so deep in me at that young age. When I turned 30 years old, I had what I would describe as my burning bush experience in life. And my wife and I, my unsuspecting wife and I, we'd been married for a year, and we went to go visit some friends in the hospital who had just had a baby. And we were just going to there to congratulate them and then to go out on our date. And so as we go to the hospital and we're just visiting with them, they just had this baby, somehow the conversation gets on this subject of human trafficking. I had never heard the term human trafficking. And our friend Julia, she starts to tell us about girls who were being forced into lifestyles of systematic rape, girls who were being forced into the commercial sex industry, into lives of prostitution. And so in my mindset at that time, slavery, or what we refer to today as human trafficking, was something that had happened in history. And I was very passionate about that. As a student in college, I had a professor who was a Shakespearean actor and also a history teacher, and he gave the best lectures on history, and his lectures on slavery were so compelling. But that's where it ended for me. I thought, this is something that happened these 100+ years ago, and that was so awful, and we grieve those things, but surely that doesn't take place today. So I'm in this hospital room, and my mind is being blown. I'm beginning to wrap my mind a little bit around this idea that slavery exists in our modern day civilized society, and that there are untold numbers of women who are being forced into lifestyles of systematic rape. And all those emotions that I had as a young child came flooding back into my heart. I literally don't remember the rest of the night. I don't remember if we went on our date or what happened from there. The next thing I remember is waking up the next morning because the Bears were playing in the Super Bowl. And I'm a diehard Bears fan, have been since I was about 8 years old. So I'm sorry for that, for anybody that might offend. Are there any Bear fans here? Okay, all right, I got one. All right, we're in it together. And I was, super jazzed to watch the Bears play that day. So though it doesn't start till late in the afternoon, I'm glued to the TV watching all the pregame specials and everything like that. But, it's like waking up and when you wake up from a nightmare and then you realize, oh, that wasn't real. And thank God that nightmare wasn't real. It was so awful. This was like waking up and then realizing, no, the nightmare is actually real. And I remember sitting in front of the TV watching all these pregame specials, but I couldn't escape the thoughts of these girls out there who were being forced into this. And the feeling just began to well in me. And I remember that afternoon, or that morning, sitting there in front of the TV, and I literally had to excuse myself into my office. And there in my office, I remember just breaking down before the Lord and just beginning to weep. And I just sobbed and just wept over this injustice. And I thought, God, how can this be? My friend Don Brewster, he says something about this issue that is really profound, and he tells it in the context of a story, but it's this idea that one girl is too many and one day is too long. And the idea that this was happening to girls around the world, day in and day out. I remember my wife and I, from that moment, we could never go to sleep at night the same knowing that this was happening. It was actually in some ways, very difficult on our own relationship. But God thrust us into this season of receiving a burden of his heart and divine compassion for this issue. It produced in us a desperation that we were going to do something to combat this heinous injustice, no matter what that looked like. So I began to study this issue for myself, and I started to read anything that I could on the subject matter. There was like one book, and 3 articles online. There was just very little awareness, but I would soak up whatever I could read. One of the first stories that I came across was the story of Debbie. She was a 15-year-old girl who was outside of her home one afternoon, one early evening in Phoenix, Arizona, wearing her SpongeBob pajamas. Her mom's inside cooking dinner for the kids. And a car pulls up and abducts her. They pull her into the car. They duct tape her mouth closed. They drive her around the city and disorient her and do a whole bunch of things to, basically begin the process of traumatizing her, to break her down, to become a sex slave. This girl was taken to an apartment where she was then gang raped, multiple men, and then kept in a small dog kennel where she was prostituted out for the next 40 days to men who were she was being advertised on Craigslist. And so these men would come to the apartment, they would take her out from the dog kennel that was hidden underneath the bed, let her out to be perpetrated against by these men. This went on for 40 days. Before a raid happened, they discovered her, and she was rescued. So, Debbie's story we know because she was rescued, but I mean, how many girls was this happening to that weren't rescued? And this was happening right here in the United States, in Phoenix, Arizona, in our own backyard. And so this stumbling across this story, started to really drive home the reality of what this issue is and what was actually going on. The U.S. Department of Justice estimates that there are 300,000 children who are at risk of commercial sexual exploitation in the U.S. every single year. Now, we think of this 15-year-old girl, especially for those of us that have daughters, it's horrific that a girl that young would be perpetrated against. As I continued to study this issue, I learned about girls who were even much younger, who were being trafficked and raped by male sex buyers around the world. I began to put together an awareness center, gathering artifacts from the front lines of trafficking around the world, and I wanted to create a center that would help people gain a palpable sense of what this is, the story that was happening in modern-day slavery. So I contacted this friend of mine, Don Brewster, in Cambodia, who's working there to rescue child sex slaves. And I said, Don, we're putting this awareness set together, and this is an awful thing to ask of you, but do you have any artifacts that we might be able to use to put into this awareness center? So the next week, he emails me back, and he said, hey, we did a raid this week. He said, and we rescued a young girl out, 7 years old. And he said, we still have her pajamas. I don't know if you can use them. They're still stained with the blood from her abuse. And how do you even answer an email like that? And I remember I just said back to him, yeah, just send them and we'll take a look. So some time goes by, I kind of forgotten about it. I guess it takes a while to get here from Southeast Asia or whatever. I come home from work one day, and I remember walking through the door. My wife was in the kitchen. Sorry. And she said, babe, you got a package in the mail. I don't know what it is. It's like some dirty clothes. So I walk into the kitchen, and I open up this package, and I pull out these pajamas. I don't know what they are either, and I hold these things up. They're like this big, these little silk pajamas. And clearly I could see where these pajamas had been stained by the blood of this girl's sexual abuse and exploitation. And I said, babe, these aren't dirty clothes. These are the blood-stained pajamas of a 7-year-old girl. And I'll never forget my wife and I just embracing that afternoon in our kitchen, and we just fell on our knees and just wept as we held each other, confronted by the reality of this injustice that is plaguing our world. Human trafficking is one of the major forces of evil that is holding our planet hostage right now. And in that moment, all the statistics became so real to me that this wasn't just about the 27 million number that we hear about or the 300,000 who are at risk. This was a real child who was really perpetrated against, and in my hands were her bloodstained pajamas. So heartbreaking. UNICEF estimates that another child like this 7-year-old girl is sold every 30 seconds in our world today. Women and girls who have been trafficked and are fortunate enough to escape talk about how difficult it is to go on with life once they've been escaped. They describe feelings of shame, isolation, and fear. A 17-year-old Moldovan girl named Stefa summed it up this way. She said, at night, when I go to bed, I pray. I pray my parents believe me that I was forced. that I am not a bad girl, that I'm not a prostitute. She said, I'm afraid to close my eyes to sleep because when I do, all I see is pain. I see the faces of all those men and I see my trafficker. I just want to forget, but I can't. At that point, Stefa gets up from the table and goes into her room and begins to sob on her bed. If a Moldovan girl is rescued from sex trafficking and returned to her home, oftentimes she will actually be ostracized from her community, seen as dirty. This is a common reality throughout the world where once a girl has experienced some form of sexual exploitation, she's considered dirty or used goods, shameful or worthless. They are treated like throwaways. There is a global stigma surrounding women's sexuality that perpetuates their traumatization. And so the recidivism rate for girls coming out of this is something in the 90% range. Imagine a girl whose life is completely sabotaged and hijacked. She's been abducted by a trafficker in Eastern Europe. She manages the miracle of escaping, only to find herself completely ostracized from her very own community back home. Another consequence of trafficking is that women and girls describe losing their capacity for love. I remember one woman I sat with in a coffee shop in Amsterdam who recounted to me the horrors of all that she experienced through sexual exploitation from a very early age in her life. She reached a point in her story when she was describing all of this where she was fighting for words to describe what had happened inside of her. The impact and the outcome of all of this exploitation. What did that amount to in her life? And I remember her just sitting there struggling to find words. And with tears streaming down her face, she finally begins to say over and over, I could not love, I could not love, I could not love. It was almost like a moment of self-revelation for her where she was crossing this personal threshold and getting into touch with the tragedy of what had happened to her, that her very own capacity for love had been robbed from her. To me, that is the greatest tragedy of all. The most precious gift of life is love. The ability to know and to be known, to experience intimacy and affection and connection. And for those who have been sexually exploited, this ability is many times stolen from them. Her innocence is taken, and she is left with feelings of shame and worthlessness. Albert Schweitzer said it this way. He said, the tragedy of life is what dies inside a man while he lives. And so when we talk about the issue of human trafficking, and when we consider the scope and the gravity of this issue, my hope tonight is that we would be able to connect in some kind of deeper way to the actual injustice that is happening in the lives of real people. When I pray concerning this issue, I often pray to God, Lord, you know these girls by name. You count the number of hairs upon her head. Your thoughts towards her are more than can be numbered. And I begin to recite to myself because I have to remember that this is not an abstract, ethereal reality. This is our very own sisters, our very own daughters who are being perpetrated against around the world, day in and day out, night after night. And that is undoubtedly happening in this very own city that we're in right now tonight. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are 4.5 million sex slaves in the world. And that doesn't take into account anything to do with girls who they would distinguish as being in prostitution in a more general sense. Just the sex trafficking component is generating $100 billion per year. I want to just highlight in closing to you three things that we can do to combat this injustice. Just real quickly, 1, 2, 3. Can somebody tell me how I'm doing on time? Where's Ernie? What do I got? Okay. Okay, so I got a few more minutes. Okay. The first thing that I want to highlight is combating the spiritual underpinnings of this. Slavery is first and foremost a spiritual issue before it is anything else. As I mentioned, one of the most ferocious forms of evil, systems of evil that is holding the planet hostage right now. This battle that we are entering when we talk about sex slavery and human trafficking and sex trafficking is a spiritual battle. Ephesians 6:12 says it this way: "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual hosts of evil in the heavenly realms." After first finding out about this, 2 days later, I was leading a prayer meeting at the International House of Prayer. And we do a briefing before we go out to actually do the prayer meeting. It's a 2-hour prayer set. And I'm telling the team about this issue. And I'm not, at this point, I'm the expert, right? I've known about it for 2 days, but nobody else knows anything. So I'm 2 days ahead of them. So I'm the expert, and I'm starting to tell them about it. And one of the singers speaks up, and she goes, "This is astounding that you're talking about this, because I just had a dream about this very thing." And she said, "I had no idea what the dream was." She said, "I was abducted by a foreign man. I was taken to the home of an American man in an upper middle class suburban neighborhood." She said, "And I had no idea what was going on, but I was taken into this home." And she said, "And suddenly I realized that this home was being used as a brothel to prostitute out girls." And she said, "And I realized what was happening, that I was being forced into a lifestyle of prostitution and rape." And she said, "In that moment, I began to see a vision of all the babies I would have to abort as a result of this lifestyle." And she said, "As I'm seeing this vision, I began to hear the intercession of Jesus breaking forth. And he's singing and crying out in intercession, saying, 'Abba, open up the heavens over the weak. Open up the heavens over the weak, Abba.'" As she shares this dream, the presence of God comes into the room, and we all get a sense of the burden of the Lord for this issue. We are ready to cry out. Before we go out to the prayer meeting, I shared this one story with the team about a friend of mine who was an undercover drug enforcement agent. He was a supervisor of his unit. He came to me one day and he said, "We had this drug trafficking ring under surveillance for 18 months. Everything was coming together. We were just getting ready to make the bust, and the whole thing slipped through our fingers. There's no explanation for it." Then he proceeded to tell me about a bust that he was involved with and responsible for, which was the largest cocaine bust in history at that time. And again, he said, but there was just no explanation for it. It was a total accident how the whole thing came into play. And I remember when he used those words, saying there's no explanation for it, and thinking to myself, actually, I believe there is an explanation for it, because there are real spiritual forces at work behind criminal activity and law enforcement. So I shared this with the team as in the way of, we need to pray that God would open up doors for authorities to make busts. We go out to the prayer meeting that night, and I share, and most people are hearing about this for the first time. And there's about 500 people in the room in that night. And I call for what we call a rapid fire prayer time, for people just to come up and pray on the mic. And people are storming to the microphone from around the room, crying out to God. It was such a powerful prayer meeting where we literally felt like God was turning the prayer room into a birth canal to release his purposes on earth as they are in heaven. We labored intensely for those 2 hours. And the next day, I get an email saying that there had been a bust, one of the largest in history. 2,700 suspects were netted in 77 countries, and this whole global ring was smashed. When the reports came out in the paper, they said it was it was almost unexplainable how the bust happened. They equated to finding a needle in a haystack because of the algorithms and certain things. It just all suddenly fell into place. But we took that as faith in our hearts that God is with us in this as we're pressing into his heart for this injustice. A few months later, we said, let's do something right here in Kansas City. Let's gather all the people together and do an all-night solemn assembly, fasting and prayer. We do that. We pray all night long. The next week, there's the first ever human trafficking bust in Kansas City. 16 locations shut down, 12 girls rescued. A Chinese trafficking ring was smashed in our very own backyard. We've continued those Monday night prayer meetings ever since, and that was the first trafficking bust. We've seen nearly 40 more trafficking busts in our backyard since that time. This is a battle that we have to win in the heavens, the courts of heaven, before we can win it in the courts of man. So we have to win it through prevailing prayer. Just the last quick testimony on this aspect of prayer. My friend was in Cambodia doing an undercover investigation of a string of brothels there. They identified 2,000 children who were being exploited in a string of brothels. The way that it works is you have to go through certain protocols to get a raid to happen. But the chief of police is the biggest trafficker in the nation. And so going through the protocols with all of their investigative data, whatever, their evidence, the raid was shut down. And my friend emailed me. He was completely discouraged, wanted to leave the mission field. He was totally disheartened through this, having the minds of all these children in his head and realizing there's nothing going to happen to rescue them. So we began to cry out. We began to pray. as we do faithfully on these Monday nights. And my friend emailed me a few days later, and I'll just read to you the email. He said, "I think you may have prayed someone to death. The highest-ranking police officer in Cambodia was killed this week when his helicopter was struck by lightning, and he died instantly. He was considered one of the biggest sex traffickers and drug traffickers in Cambodia. Oddly enough, when his death hit the papers, everyone was rejoicing. All the Christians were saying God killed him." Now, I mean, I don't know what that does for your theology. I'm not encouraging precatory prayers, because we know that God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but we do know that he rejoices in establishing justice. And I do know this, that I do not want to be standing in God's way when he arises to bring about justice on behalf of the oppressed. And God hears the cries of the saints. We have seen specific prayer after prayer after prayer after prayer answered by God in the most specific ways as we have pressed into him in this capacity. The second thing that I just want to quickly highlight is combating the facilitating culture. We have to combat it in the spiritual way. We have to combat the facilitating culture. We live in a culture where sex has become completely meaningless, where men are socialized to consume women as sexual objects, and where women are socialized to objectify their own sexuality. Well, thinking about slavery from a historical perspective, slavery has always been rooted in a social construct of thought in which exploitation is normalized under the condition of monetary benefit. In other words, where slavery thrived on the premise that the ends justify the means. And so the challenge for abolitionists of generations past was to shift the locus of thought surrounding the issue of slavery and the mass conscience of society, to literally rewrite the narrative of their culture. Abraham Lincoln put it this way. He said, "Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." We've seen this in other movements as well. Take, for instance, the women's suffragist movement. I'm talking about shifting the cultural narrative, right? I mean, it's hard for us to imagine this now, but we lived at a time in our nation's history when the consensus of society was that women should not be allowed to vote. I mean, right, it's almost unthinkable to us now. But there was a time, and a few courageous voices stood up and said, "This is insane. You know, the emperor's not wearing clothes. What are we talking about? Women cannot have the right to vote." Right? And so now, I mean, and these courageous voices brought about a critical mass, a turning point. They changed the narrative, the cultural narrative concerning women in our society. They shift the locus of thought and the mass conscience of society and brought about this liberation of women and brought about dignity for women in the place of voting. But looking back at the three movements of abolition in history, we can see where the central battle was really over the narrative of the culture. That was consistent during the time of Wilberforce, it was consistent during the time of Lincoln, and it was consistent during the time of the abolition of the Congolese from King Leopold III at the turn of the century. In all three of these times, it was their work to change public perception and shift the narrative of the culture that brought about the liberation of slaves. I just think of, how strategic Uncle Tom's Cabin was by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was said that there was this book that paved the way for Lincoln's election and contributed to the outbreak of the war by personalizing the political and economic arguments about slavery. When Lincoln met Stowe for the first time, it was recorded that he famously greeted her with these words, "So you're that little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The power of creative media to shift the culture. It's the same thing, again, I don't have time to go into these other examples. They're fascinating and, research it out, I guess. But what we are doing through film and messaging and storytelling and all of this is not just about awareness or even just education. It is about rewriting the narrative of our culture. Bertolt Brecht once said, "Art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it." The last thing that I just want to say to you in terms of how do we combat this global heinous injustice is combating the exploitation industries. The existence of the commercial sex industry, pornography, prostitution, stripping, is the institutionalization of sexual violence against women. It has no place in our society, and we must bring it to an end. And so we have to dig deep into making strides through the area of legal reform to shift the laws in our society that allow for these exploitation industries to continue. What I witnessed investigating the porn industry for the year that I spent basically in the porn industry with pornographers and performers was utterly horrific in terms of the vast amount of trafficking that is going on. And so I think our culture is still in many ways out of touch with the degree to which people in the sex industry are being exploited, violated against, perpetrated against day in and day out. So again, just in closing, just to highlight these three things: the spiritual component, the social component, and the legal component of this are so critical. What I am excited about tonight is the hope that the next generation represents, that these law students represent, to take this mantle, as it was said, of Wilberforce, and to run with it, to give their whole lives to it, to literally sacrifice their lives upon this altar of injustice, to give themselves to advancing the cause of justice on behalf of the oppressed. We have an opportunity tonight to help mobilize real lives into this battle, the next generation of Wilberforces. So I want to invite you guys to participate in that in any way that you can. I'm not sure how the rest of the plan is, but if we're given an opportunity tonight to do that, I want to invite you all to do that. So thank you so much.